of the Directors Guild of America. A look at the weather. Rain, sleet and snow across central and some southern areas, clearing overnight. Then patchy freezing fog, ice and frost, and another cold day tomorrow. Our top sports story this hour: the English Football League have confirmed 112 new positive cases of Covid among 66 clubs during the latest round of testing. All EFL clubs will now be tested twice a week from Monday. We'll have a full sports roundup at past.
UK on DAB digital radio, on the free Times Radio app and via your smart speaker. This is Times Radio with Kait Borsay.
Good evening, Kait Borsay joining you here on Times Radio until 1 a.m. Lovely to have you with us. I hope you're well. I hope you've survived the first week of lockdown. Is it first week? I can't remember when it started now. All the days have blurred into one, folks. So that's what homeschooling for 3 days does to you. It sends you mad. I'm surprised I'm barely getting a word out this evening. My brain is fried, but I'm loving being with you, and it is a nice bit of respite. I tell you what, I ran out of the door to work today. Bye! An escape from my kids. Listen, so many of you I know are either suffering or know someone who is suffering at the moment with COVID-19. I hope you are all bearing up well. Of course, so many worrying figures, aren't there, swirling around. And of course, we need to take care. We need to take responsibility for this ourselves. No one knows this as well as people who suffer from long COVID, who've not only been dealing with the after effects of contracting COVID-19, some of them for months, some of them for up to a year, but also must sometimes walk around and wonder why people aren't being responsible and why you're not wearing masks, because anyone who's experienced long COVID will know what a tough challenge it has been, and that really it is our own responsibility to try and avoid this virus, to stay at home as much as we possibly can. That is our responsibility. Well, next week in the House of Commons, members of Parliament are dedicating the week to debate and discuss the condition of long COVID, post-COVID syndrome, as it's now officially called. The number of people suffering in the UK is growing, of course, as an offshoot of the growing number of infections. The Office of National Statistics tells us that 1 in 10, so 10% of people that contract COVID-19 are still suffering from its effects 12 weeks later. That's 1 in 5, by the way, for 5 weeks later. But if we're to look at 12 weeks, 3 months, at 1 in 10, 10%. So if you look at where we are now with figures at the moment, just under 3 million people in the UK have tested positive for COVID-19. Boil that down to 1 in 10, that's 300,000 people who are going to be suffering from long COVID. Bearing in mind that that 3 million figure doesn't include people from the first wave who weren't tested, and still now people in families not being tested, because if mum and dad have got it, the kids are bound to have it, they just don't get the tests. Think about how that 300,000 figure could be something more like 400,000 or 500,000. And so here we have potentially another public health emergency, certainly a huge and serious issue for the months and years to come. Let's speak to Claire Hastie, and we're going to be getting a whole range of experts during this 45 minutes to discuss long COVID with us. Claire Hastie is founder of the Long COVID Support Group on Facebook, and she's had long COVID for 10 months. Good evening to you, Claire. Thanks for joining us.
Good evening.
Can I ask how you're feeling? I know we spoke, didn't we, back last in September, October. Tell us about your symptoms at the moment, some 10 months after getting COVID.
My symptoms are largely all still there, although they have improved. They've definitely improved since the early months. But it's one of those things where you see progress if you look back month on month. You don't see progress on a week by week, and certainly not on a day by day basis. I still struggle to walk more than about 100 metres, so I don't really leave the house unless someone can push me in a wheelchair, and so I don't really leave the house very much. I have joint pain. I have cognitive issues. I really struggle to concentrate. I get distracted easily. I can't really process information. So I struggle to watch. If I try to watch a documentary, I often have to rewind it frequently because I just can't
try and listen
the information.
Again.
Yeah. So yes, all sorts. Heart pain. palpitations, breathlessness are all still there, but they are definitely, I feel like I'm heading in the right direction, but at a glacial pace, and there are good days and bad days.
Yeah, I'm sure there are, and I appreciate you staying up late for us this evening. I wish this was a 4:00 show, actually, when we do long COVID, because
insomnia is another symptom.
Oh, well, yes, I suppose it is. Yes, I suppose it is. So you feel like you're slowly getting better. When we last spoke, we talked about the fact that there wasn't enough exposure, that you felt, as do the tens of thousands of people who are part of your long COVID support group, just felt you weren't being taken seriously. Has that changed?
It certainly has changed, and there's been some great initial steps. So we saw the publication of the NICE guideline just before Christmas, which, it's great that it exists. I think we would argue it needs some work doing to it, but it's good that it exists, and it's a living guideline, so they're planning to update it. There's been the announcement of COVID assessment services, clinics. So some people are accessing those. They are patchy in location, the devolved nations in particular. I'm not sure that they're getting the support actually that people in England who live near a clinic are getting. But even in England, the service is patchy. But if your GP doesn't believe you've got long COVID, then they won't refer you. So we're finding members of our group are struggling. So even though a clinic might be listed in a press release of the NHS, the GPs may not actually know it exists or be able to access, even if they phone the institution. And then also they sometimes are denying that the patient has long COVID. So there's lots of work still to be done. We're very grateful for the research funds that have been put towards non-hospitalised patients, but the answers or any answers cannot come soon enough, because we are, people have been ill now for a year, or coming on for a year in lots of cases. In March, you'll see a lot of anniversaries. The people who fell ill like I did in mid-March before the first lockdown, we feel like with a herd immunity, there's going to be a big spike in anniversaries that month, and it's a grim date.
Yeah, it certainly is. I know people are struggling with mental health because, of course, when you continually feel like you're not getting better, or you're only slowly getting better, and people aren't believing you, or you feel like people don't or aren't taking you seriously enough, and you can't work, maybe you're financially struggling, that can lead to severe mental health issues. And I gather that there have been suicides within your group, Claire.
Oh, I'm not aware of suicides, but frankly, I don't think I would be, because if someone stops posting in the group, then we wouldn't know the reason for that. So but we certainly have people who have talked about harming themselves and have made attempts to do that. We hold lots of sort of Zoom calls for people and social activities and gatherings, and we've had words like harm and suicide as keyword alerts from the beginning of the group, and we reach out to people, signpost them to services, offer to speak with them and Zoom with them, and we sort of follow them over time and check in with them and do what we can. But this, we've got some seriously ill, frightened people who've lost their homes, people who've lost their livelihoods, lots of children with it. That's not talked about enough at all. It's a serious problem. We actually helped to organise a research conference before Christmas. It's a global conference that Dr. Tedros of the WHO spoke at. And there's an interesting presentation there from Hong Kong where they showed that administration of antivirals within a week of symptom onset looks like, I'm sure it probably needs more investigation, but looks to have potentially avoided long COVID. So frankly, I don't think we should be pinning all our hopes on the vaccine. And I don't know how long it's going to be till I get a vaccine, for example. Yeah. Should I be on a vulnerable list or not because I've got long COVID? That's a whole other question. But it might not be months till I get vaccinated. Well, every day people are testing positive. So if there's a way of somehow finding some antivirals or some other early interventional treatment to prevent this time bomb of an issue, because almost 70% of people who've been ill for 7 months are not able to work to their full capacity, according to the recent patient-led research survey. Okay. Almost 70%. Yeah. 20-something percent cannot work at all. Today I had to speak to my HR manager and say, I'm afraid it's going to be months rather than weeks because I cannot concentrate enough to do my job.
I hear you. I've got a question here that I wonder if you might like to answer for us, Claire, just based on your experience of heading up the long COVID support group. Sherilyn has tweeted in and said, how do we deal with trying to explain our condition to the wider community, employers and health assessors when there are so many people who don't even believe that COVID exists in the first place and think that long COVID is therefore just attention seeking? Any advice for Sherilyn?
I think that's a huge problem. And actually, I'd even go further than that and say a lot of people themselves probably won't realise they've had COVID or long COVID because the symptoms are so poorly communicated. If you go on the NHS website, it still talks about fever, cough and anosmia. Well, patients have known for months. That same survey I talked about 200 and odd symptoms. We actually did a social media campaign. We've got no budget, of course, but back in August we did a little social media advert saying, if something feels odd about your body, just think to yourself, could it be COVID? So there'll be people walking around in supermarkets right now, maybe with diarrhea or with purple toes or with strange headaches or very strange neurological symptoms that won't realise that can be a symptom of COVID, and they'll be out and about in the community. So I would urge anybody, if something feels odd about your body or looks odd, like my son had purple toes for 4 months, but he felt fine, one of my kids. So if something's weird, just get a test and stay at home until you've had the result of that test. So back to your question, I digress. It's incredibly difficult. That's why I'm talking to people like you to try and really appreciate
raise
the media
awareness.
platform to raise awareness. It is not a hoax.
Okay.
Come and talk to us anytime.
Yeah, Sherilyn, check out the Long COVID support group. Claire, we may have time to get back to you later. We may not. We've got lots of people to speak to, but I really, really appreciate you and your time this evening. If we don't speak to you again.
Just in case.
Yeah, lovely. Claire, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you. Let's speak to former Health Minister Norman Lamb now to give us some insight into the framework, the policy and support that government might be able to put in place. Appreciate you joining us. Thank you, Norman.
Pleasure.
Thank you for coming along and speaking to us this evening. You are head of an NHS Trust, a former health minister. Tell us what your understanding is of long COVID and whether you feel from the position you're in as to whether it's being taken seriously enough. Is there enough resource being put into research by the government?
Well, it's an emerging picture, and we've got to ensure that we invest properly in research and that we scale up the response as the numbers increase. When they announced back in October the opening of these local clinics around the country, there was a set number of people who we anticipated would be suffering from long COVID. But of course, the numbers since then have rocketed. My particular area of interest is mental health. I chair a mental health trust in London. And the psychological fallout from COVID is going to be immense. Particularly with long COVID, when you hear about the experiences of someone in Claire's situation, coping with all of those impacts on your life, there are going to be, for many people, very significant psychological consequences. And I suppose my plea to the government is just plan now, plan ahead for what we know is coming down the track. £10 million was invested by NHS England in these to sort of trigger these local clinics back in October. But that's not going to be enough for the scale of the challenge that we're now going to face as a result of the numbers of people who are now being infected. So this is a very significant public mental health challenge that will continue for some considerable time after the end of the main physical pandemic has ended.
Yeah.
So, we've got to prepare for that now. And if we just rely on existing mental health services, for example, in terms of the psychological impact, they will be overwhelmed. Waiting lists already are unacceptably long. We've got to make sure that we provide digital access to support. I happen to chair an advisory board for a digital mental health company called Kovid. That sort of support for people through their mobile phones to guide them through how to support themselves, how to maintain resilience, I think is also going to be incredibly important. But this is a very significant challenge. We know what's coming down the track and the government has to prepare now.
Do you think that the hunt for vaccines, the focus on vaccines and on medicine treatment for people suffering with long COVID, do you think that that's overshadowed the need to invest in long COVID, in treatment and in solutions for people suffering with long COVID?
Well, I'm quite sure that it has predominantly been crisis management, just, navigating your way through an extraordinary crisis. And I mean, this would have tested the most competent government imaginable. This probably isn't the most competent government imaginable. But I don't think there has been the capacity within government to do a sufficient amount of planning for the longer term psychological fallout from this pandemic. And that's what really worries me. I mean, I came together with about 60 other organisations and individuals to call for a resilience task force to be established so that we can involve experts from a whole range of sectors to plan now for a public mental health response to this crisis. We didn't get a sufficient response from the government. I know that there is work underway across government departments, but they need to be much more public about it, and they need to be much clearer in their guidance about how we can support communities through this crisis. Because on top of long COVID and the psychological consequences of that, we also have the likely psychological impact of unemployment, of the build-up of debt, of isolation and loneliness, of the loss of a loved one in your family.
And this is an area...
All of these risk factors are out there, here and now.
Yeah, and this is an area which cannot be ignored. I do want to raise the issue of financial support just briefly with you, Norman Lamb. What can the government do? Should the government be recognising long COVID sufferers and offering them some sort of benefit? Because we heard earlier 70% can't work to full capacity. Many aren't eligible for any benefits at all and have no idea when or if they will be able to be in a fit state to work again.
Well, there has to be a flexible response to support those people in their needs. We can't throw people on the scrap heap. That would be wholly wrong. And this has to be a collective endeavour. We all, I think, have a responsibility to contribute to ensure that people can be protected through some pretty dark hours, I think, that we have ahead of us.
OK, all right. Thank you so much for speaking to us. Former Health Minister Norman Lamb, very much focusing on the mental health impact. So don't forget, it's not just the physical symptoms, it's the mental health fallout from those suffering with long COVID. And I'll repeat those figures again. If there are nearly 3 million recorded cases of COVID-19 in the UK, 1 in 10 are still suffering the effects of it 12 weeks after contracting it. That means at the moment we're looking at around 300,000 people who are being affected by long COVID. That's just on the cases recorded. So think about those cases earlier on in the pandemic which weren't recorded, which aren't official figures, and think about how much further we've still got to go through this second, third wave, whatever you want to call it, in terms of those numbers. So something to really be aware of there. I'd like to bring in a bit of a medical perspective now. Dr. David Arnold joins us, researcher at North Bristol NHS Trust, and he's leading the Discovery Covid study. Good evening to you, Dr. David Arnold.
Good evening.
Hello. Tell us about the Discovery Covid study then. What are you looking at specifically?
Well, at the beginning of this pandemic, a colleague and I in North Bristol NHS Trust set up a study essentially trying to consecutively recruit patients who are admitted to the hospital with COVID-19. And since they've been discharged, we've been seeing these patients regularly at 3 months and now again at 8 months, essentially asking them about their symptoms, doing blood tests, looking at their immunity, and also chest x-rays and breathing tests as well.
OK. And what percentage of the people who you're initially seeing are coming back to you and reporting symptoms some months later?
Well, it's exactly like you say. You've got to remember this is a hospitalised cohort, so all these people generally had a positive COVID test. And we found that 12 weeks later, 75%, so 3/4 of people, still had ongoing symptoms that they attributed to COVID-19.
Wow.
We're currently, as we speak, we're doing another clinic next week, seeing people at 8 months. And people are still reporting significant problems, even 8 months on. Yeah,
I don't doubt it at all. Is there any evidence there that if you suffer badly the first time round with COVID, that you're much more likely to get long COVID? Is there any direct correlation or are there any percentages concerning that?
Well, yes. I mean, I think a lot of hospital studies now have shown that the proportion is really quite high. So often well over 50% who will be suffering long COVID if you were brought into hospital, especially if you went to intensive care. I was quite struck by the figures you talked about, even patients in the community, 10% of them still suffering at 3 months. It is quite remarkable, really. And you'd expect those people to have a significantly milder initial illness. So there doesn't seem to be a huge correlation between the two, does there?
No, okay. And in terms of treatment, has there been any move forward, anything interesting you've seen in the last 3 months or so, which would count as a significant development into helping some of these long COVID sufferers? Because although everyone is sympathetic and there are clinics being set up, many of them would just like some treatment. They'd like some movement forward with research and treatment.
Yeah, and I can completely understand the frustration. I thought that was a really powerful interview with Claire earlier. I think the real problem that we've got is at the moment we're at the stage where we're just trying to define the problem, estimating its scale, and trying to understand exactly what the cause is. The majority of studies going on at the moment, you've got the huge FOSS-COVID study being run out of the University of Leicester, and you've got studies now coming out of Wuhan, China, so patients who've been followed up for a significant proportion of time. And what studies are really looking at is evidence of organ damage at these late time points, and then exploring these patients' immune system to see if that holds the key to exactly why some people are struggling for such long periods of time.
Yeah, we've discussed on this show before autoantibodies and the fact that the immune system might be turning on itself, and that's sort of one theory, isn't it? I know.
That's right, yeah. I think you had Professor Aaron Ring from Yale.
From Yale on, yeah.
A couple of weeks ago, and I listened to that show. And that's incredibly important work they're doing over there. Essentially, just to summarise, they discovered using a new, what's called a REAP platform, which essentially rapidly looks at patients' autoantibodies. So antibodies that were originally created by the body to attack the virus are then turning on the body itself, which might explain some of these symptoms. We listened to the show and I was struck by the fact that Aaron said that they were really struggling to get samples. So we actually contacted him, and now that is now an active collaboration between Bristol and Yale. So that's the power of media.
So Times Radio has been instrumental in a UK-US connection with autoantibodies. I absolutely love that. Thank you so much for telling me that. We're going to ask you to hang on if that's okay, Dr. David. I've got some questions for you, and I'm sure there'll be more to discuss as we go on and we listen to a few more case studies. Really appreciate your time with us this evening. We will return to you again. Dr. David Arnold, researcher at the North Bristol NHS Trust. He's leading the Discovery COVID study. Let's go to a case study now. A person who's been suffering with long COVID syndrome for 12 months. The longest suffering member in the Facebook long COVID support group we mentioned earlier that Claire Hastie runs. Nick Mitchell joins me now. Nick, good evening to you.
Good evening, Kate.
It's not a title that anyone wants, is it really? The longest suffering member of that Facebook group? Just tell me about how you're feeling right now. You obviously contracted COVID 12 months ago. What's the situation for you now?
Well, like Claire said, having an anniversary of 12 months is something, firstly, I never thought I'd have to get to. And when I did get to it, and indeed it was actually Christmas Day, it was 25th December 2019 when I first became ill. And when I had to face that, bearing in mind I'm locked down, living on my own, spending Christmas and New Year completely on my own. I haven't seen a person other than repair people, doctors and hospitals and paramedics for 10 months now. So it was pretty horrific, in all honesty.
It is pretty horrific. I mean, it's an ongoing situation. Like you're being more supported now, Nick, or are there still huge holes?
Well, very fortunately, but as a bizarre turn of circumstances, I now have a lovely GP who's very empathetic. But because I had the virus so early, I was told initially it was swine flu because I'd travelled to the Caribbean and actually, I think, caught the virus at Gatwick when 7 flights from Wuhan came in the same day that I stayed there. So my first GP saw all these bizarre symptoms, from the sudden rashes, the shortness of breath, the huge swings in blood pressure, and all these crazy things. And she actually put it down to mental health and tried to section me under the Mental Health Act.
Wow.
Now, clearly she failed, because we then detected that I'd actually had sepsis, which had driven a lot of the cardiac problems and a lot of my sort of having a small stroke, having a heart attack. I'm only 50. I'm not that old, and I was very healthy and energetic, but I had to change GPs. Well, my GP who tried to section me effectively sacked me and then realised the error of her ways. So I went on to a new GP who's now more empathetic. But I'm not the only one. As Claire rightly says, this is horrible, not being believed. And sadly, I was so early with my symptoms, I was not believed by my own family. I lost my own family support, as well as all my friends' support, because they caught things off me thinking it was swine flu. And when they realised it was COVID, they've held me responsible ever since.
Oh, goodness me. I'm so sorry, Nick. That is an awful situation to be in. Listen, tell me about your position or your situation with work and employment.
I was hoping to tell you something cheerier, but I mentioned to one of your producers, I'm also part of Excluded UK, which unfortunately has about 2.9 million people who've been completely excluded by Rishi Sunak. When he hands out his money, he has unfortunately completely forgotten about a large community, mainly of self-employed people. And as a self-employed person, who is also a private landlord with a flat that I bought many, many years ago, I don't qualify for anything. So irrelevant of the fact that I'm self-employed and am a private landlord who's had an empty place where I've still had to pay everything for the property, but with no tenants because they were all losing jobs and staying with their parents and things, I have nothing. I've lost everything. My house has been up for sale, my car's been sold, all my jewellery has been sold. I'm living day to day by selling things in my house in order to do things, to feed myself, to get prescription costs, which I'm still having to pay for because I don't qualify for universal credit.
Goodness me, Nick, I'd really love you to stay with us. I'm so sorry about what you're going through, and I think, you are such a great example of someone who's been forgotten in so many ways, and it's so important that we keep pushing for research, we keep pushing for treatment as well for those suffering from long COVID, because there must feel like there's no way out for you at the moment.
There's some great research, and that is really, really good to see, and most of it is not coming from the UK. I'm part of the trial that Oxford University did into organ damage, where they found the multiple organ damage that I'd had.
Yeah.
But as a result, I started speaking to scientists internationally who were interested in me as one of the early cases. And there's some great research, and there are some really positive messages coming out about how to not just prevent yourself getting long COVID, but also once you do have it, how to mitigate the results of it. So if we get time, I'm quite happy to share that with you.
Fabulous. I'd like to stay with us. We will try and grab a couple more minutes with you before 11:45, when we have to leave the subject alone and go on to something else. But do stay with us. I appreciate your time. Nick Mitchell has been suffering from long COVID for 12 months. Let's get a quick news update from Anna Cunningham. We'll be back with more on long COVID. That's coming up in just a few minutes' time.
Across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio.
Kait, thank you. There's been a record number of daily coronavirus-related deaths reported in the UK. 1,325 people have died within 28 days of testing positive. Another 68,053 new positive cases were also recorded. London's Mayor Sadiq Khan has declared a major incident across the city.
The virus is out of control. The NHS is at risk of being overwhelmed.
He's warned that the capital's hospitals will run out of beds within weeks if the spread of coronavirus is not dramatically reduced. New research has found that more than 3/4 of coronavirus patients have at least one ongoing symptom 6 months after first being unwell. The study, published in The Lancet, found that levels of antibodies fell by more than half after 6 months, raising the question of possible reinfections. Long COVID includes muscle fatigue, sleep difficulties, anxiety and depression. Meanwhile, a third coronavirus vaccine has been approved for use in the UK. The vaccine, made by US drugs firm Moderna, will be made available by spring. In America, and the US President-elect Joe Biden has said it's good that Donald Trump is not planning to attend his inauguration. The Speaker of the US House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, has just issued a statement after meeting with members saying they hope the president will immediately resign. And if this doesn't happen, she says she has instructed the Rules Committee to be prepared to move forward with Congressman Jamie Raskin's 25th Amendment legislation and a motion for impeachment. And some breaking news we can bring you here tonight on Times Radio. Twitter has just announced that it has permanently suspended Donald Trump's Twitter account. In a statement, it says, after close review of recent tweets from Donald Trump's account and the context around them, specifically how they are being received and interpreted on and off Twitter, they have permanently suspended the account due to the risk of further incitement of violence. The breaking news that Twitter has permanently suspended Donald Trump's Twitter account. A look at the weather. Outbreaks of rain, sleet and snow across central and some southern areas will clear overnight, leaving clear skies, allowing for a widespread frost, ice and patchy freezing fog.
This is Times Radio.
Good evening, Kait Borsay, Times Radio here. Well, as you've just been hearing from Anna, Twitter has released a statement. It's come via the Twitter safety account as well. And this gives us the news that Donald Trump's Twitter account has been permanently suspended due to the risk of further incitement of violence. So some real hardcore action there from Twitter, who has permanently suspended Donald Trump's Twitter account. Fortunately, he can't tweet to tell us what he thinks of that decision, can he? There is more coming up at 12:30, by the way. We're speaking to Shira Ovide, who's written a couple of great pieces about the responsibility of social media platforms, particularly when it comes to inciting violence, and on the back of the events in Capitol Hill this week. Let's carry on with our long COVID section. I'm going to bring in another case study now. Nick, we may be able to catch up with later just for some advice on dealing with long COVID, what to do if you think you're suffering from long COVID. Nick has been suffering from it for the last 12 months. I want to bring on in now our next guest, and that is Monique Jackson. She's been suffering from long COVID since March. Good evening, Monique. Thanks for joining us again on Times Radio.
Good evening, Kait.
Hiya, Monique. Listen, tell us how you're feeling at the moment. We last spoke to you in October. What's happened since then?
Well, I'm still suffering from the effects of long COVID. Over 9 months in, I've got shortness of breath, numbness and heaviness on one side of my body, chest and abdomen pain, palpitations and fatigue. But I have got some improvement in my condition, and I've been capable of doing some of my artwork that I do during this period. It's just very unpredictable what my body's going to do next.
Yeah, Monique has a fantastic Instagram account called Corona Diary, and it basically charts her journey of long COVID, and the illustrations are fantastic. So a big shout out for you for that, Monique.
Thank you.
Tell me about whether anyone has suggested any treatment. Are you currently looking into, or have you had any treatment at all that seems to be working?
I have sort of been accessing through my GP bits of medication at the beginning. I was given drugs like omeprazole to deal with my gastric pain, and pretty much told to stay home and take paracetamol. I've had to really fight to get my body documented because it's not been something that's easy to get. There's been no pathway of care. I was told that I had anxiety because of the chest pains I was getting, but now it's been confirmed that I have a heart condition of some kind, but it's not been diagnosed. From my research, it seems that other people with long COVID seem to be having similar symptoms.
Okay. And so most of the treatment you've been given is all, dealing with each element of your long COVID, each symptom as an individual thing rather than as a more, as a more global approach, I suppose. Are you slowly getting better? Do you feel like there are improvements and that you might be able to think about working back to your old capacity? Does it feel hopeful, or does it still feel really frustrating?
I've kind of, recovery is not in a straight line. That's the first thing I've learned. It's through the education, through other chronic health campaigners, through being online on Instagram, that has taught me that to have patience. And sometimes I have good days and sometimes I have bad days. People who suffer from ME, CPC, for instance, have kind of helped educate me on the subject. For me, I've been overall, my shortness of breath has been improving, so my mobility's got better. I still, though, have some weeks where it's just flare-ups, where I will get pain with no warning, and I won't be able to sleep through. So it's really meant, even though I'm fortunate enough to be furloughed, friends of mine who are suffering from the same thing have asked for flexibility from their employers, because they can do the work, but they just can't do it within the same strict
the
time
regular
frame.
hours. Yeah. Have you had access, or will you have access to any of the long COVID clinics, Monique?
I have not. I have heard rumours from back in July from doctors that there were some planned. However, I've not met anyone who's been able to refer me or register me, or even knows how to get me on there. It's something that I'd be really keen to know about, because I know that there are supposed to be 60 available, and I'm really concerned about those that have long COVID in Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland,
devolved nations.
who I don't know if they will have access.
Yeah, we've had lots and lots of tweets and messages about that, and I understand that those clinics are still being set up, so that may be why we're not hearing too much about them yet. I think it's 10 million quid and 60 clinics. When we start to look at the figures in relation to how many people have tested positive for COVID-19, let alone people like you, Monique, who know that you've had it, you just had no access to a test, that sort of seems to be wildly insufficient. Monique, we've got Dr. David Arnold with us. Is there a question that you'd like to pose to him?
It would be about investment in treatment for long COVID. Is there any information on this? Because a lot of emphasis on the news right now is on vaccines.
OK, let's bring Dr. David Arnold, researcher at North Bristol NHS Trust. He's leading the Discovery Covid study. Can I get your take on that, Dr. David?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think the reason there's a huge amount of focus on the vaccine is because I think the best thing for long COVID would be a prevention, really. It seems like a really, really tricky disease at the moment to work out exactly what's going on, and certainly to find any treatments. There are studies going on from the University of Leicester, a large one called FOS-COVID, where they're looking into the possibility that something called pulmonary rehab might be useful for patients who are persistently short of breath. We're setting up a study looking at fatigue management strategies. But in terms of a medication, a pill that you could take, I don't know of any proven medications out there at the moment, I'm afraid.
Yeah, so each symptom is being dealt with sort of on an individual basis, whether it's fatigue management,
Exactly, yeah.
whether it's issues with heart or with lungs or with liver, etc. Dr. David, also something to run by you. This story was embargoed until 11:30 this evening. You heard Anna in our news speak about it, and this is a study which has been published in the Lancet, and this is looking at people who were admitted to hospital in Wuhan during the early stages of the pandemic and the subsequent research on them. Are you able to sort of give us a little overview on this? There's an interesting line here about neutralising antibodies fell by more than half after 6 months in 94 patients whose immune response was tested at the peak of the infection. What does that tell us?
I might come to that last if that's okay.
Yeah, fine. Yeah, of course.
This is an extraordinary study by Huang and colleagues and just published today in the Lancet. They followed up 1,733 of their patients who were admitted, and presumably some of the first in the world to get coronavirus. Extraordinarily, because this is quite a young cohort for people who've been in hospital with a mean age of only 57. Again, much like our study in Bristol, 3/4 of them were still reporting ongoing symptoms 6 months later. And the symptoms that Monique and Nick and Claire are talking about, things like shortness of breath, muscle aches, extreme fatigue. That is really, really important, and it's a huge study, and I really look forward to reading it properly. In terms of the neutralizing antibodies, I'm taking sort of less away from that, to be honest.
Okay.
We know that antibodies will wane over time. The fact that they're neutralizing antibodies mean that they are slightly more specific to the coronavirus. But actually, other cells, like our T cells from our immune system, come in and start acting as well. So we've known for a long time that antibodies will wane. There's been large studies that show that you are quite well protected if you have had COVID before. So probably the more important thing from this study is that symptom burden that people are still experiencing, even with quite young patients.
I've got loads of questions over Twitter and via text message here to go through with you. I'm going to focus on children. So I'm an admin, says Smokey Red, on the long COVID parents group. An ever-growing concern from the long COVID community is the effects on children. My daughter's 9 and on oxygen at night due to an ear operation as she has an unknown infection and she gets various rashes. Still, long COVID isn't accepted. Have you done any work, or is there any research on children and these poor kids being, affected by long COVID?
Yeah, I saw that tweet, and that sounds absolutely terrible. I'm so sorry to hear about that. I think I can't comment on the individual case, of course, without knowing a few more details. But the thing that's important is that multisystem inflammatory syndrome, which is the syndrome that affects children, remains really quite rare. The prognosis for a lot of children will be really, really good. Of course, some children will get long-term symptoms. The problem is that because they are quite few and far between, the research has been really, really patchy. So if you think that the research is at a really early stage for adults, it's really quite embryonic for children, I'm afraid.
Okay, another one here saying, I've read that American clinics have developed and are trialling new medication for long COVID and post-viral treatment. I don't know any more than that, so that's from Stu Warp. Does that ring any bells?
So essentially, I don't know if you've heard of the treatment remdesivir.
Made famous by Mr. Trump.
Essentially, it's an antiviral which was invented in the States. And people are trying that to see if it does help long COVID. I think by the time you develop long COVID symptoms, an antiviral it's likely to be a little too late. Again, like I said to Monique, I don't know of any proven therapies, sort of like tablets or injections for long COVID at the moment, unfortunately.
Claire Hastie, who heads up a long COVID support group, was on with us earlier, and she said she attended a conference that they helped to put together before Christmas, and there was some evidence there that in Hong Kong they had no or very few cases of long COVID, because as soon as someone contracted COVID-19, they were given antivirals. Could there be anything to that?
Right. So that's a study from Hong Kong, and you've got to remember that the numbers they're dealing with are just completely different to ours. So they were given treatment, they're given interferon beta, an HIV treatment called Kaletra, and ribavirin, another one. All medications that you wouldn't give to the 3 million people with coronavirus in this country. The cost alone would be extraordinary and the side effects would be quite considerable. I think the problem is that the coronavirus is sort of out of control in the UK at the moment. Trying to cover every single person who develops COVID with some antivirals to try and prevent them developing long COVID would be impossible.
Excellent, Dr. David Arnold there. I'm going to cut that off brief because I do want to get Nick back on just to give some community advice to long COVID sufferers. We really appreciate your time with us, Dr. David Arnold, researcher at North Bristol NHS Trust, who's leading the Discovery COVID study. Thank you so much for your time this evening. Let's just bring back Nick. I just want to get a little bit of community help from her. Nick Mitchell, who's had long COVID syndrome for 12 months. Nick, we discussed earlier, and we've got a couple of minutes for this, a bit of advice from you. So in your 12 months of suffering from long COVID, if someone out there is suffering too, what bits of advice can we give them? What have you learnt during this process?
Okay, so there's actually 5, but the most important is sleep and rest. Do not fight this virus. make sure when you feel awful, when you feel you're having a relapse, when you feel under the weather, when you can't go to work, don't go to work. Sleep as much as possible. In the States, they're taking melatonin, which actually helps your sleep regulation pattern, but it's not actually necessary. And obviously, I'm not a doctor, but what has come through two big bits of research, the body politic piece that Claire mentioned, and another one in the States, is vitamin C, vitamin D, quercetin, niacin, and antihistamine. Now, antihistamine you can buy for hay fever and asthma, and there's a correlation actually between long COVID sufferers and those that have hay fever, asthma. Over the counter, Pyretes, cetirizine hydrochloride, and make sure that you do take a low histamine diet, which you'd have to Google because I'm not a nutritionist.
Yeah.
But it's definitely no tomatoes and no avocados.
Okay, and important for us to say, you're not a doctor either, so
No,
do please
it's just
check
research,
at home. Yeah.
But it's over 3,000 people have all fed back that those things help them.
Yeah, and do please, if you're at home, check that that you can take all those things. If you've got any concerns, do speak to your doctor. I hope they are receptive. And that's an important part of it as well. You need to feel like people are on your side, Nick. If you're not happy with your GP, change your GP. If you don't feel like you're well informed, join the long COVID support group. And this community of long COVID support sufferers, I don't think we can underestimate how important you are.
Thank you. It's life-saving.
Yeah, it is. It is indeed. Let's bring back a quick word from Claire Hastie, who runs that long COVID support group. Claire, just a final word from you. If someone wants more information or is really, really feeling the effects financially, of course, it's so frustrating that there isn't any, specific benefit for this. And we've tried to get someone on this evening to speak about how perhaps you can be catered for financially, but it didn't all come together. But just a final word from you to anyone out there who's suffering from long COVID or knows someone who is.
Yeah, please head to our website, longcovid.org, and from there you'll find links to our Twitter account. There'll be some resources on there, and also the link to our community on Facebook, where we will put our collective arms around you and we will get through this step by step together somehow.
And the most important thing is you are being recognised. There are studies going on. There's a big push now for treatment. That has to be the next stage, doesn't it? Not just those individual quirks of each long COVID case being treated bit by bit, but we need to see some more joined up treatment, I suppose.
Systemic issues,
yeah, definitely. Well, listen, Claire, I appreciate your time. Thank you so much to everyone who's joined us this evening. Nick Mitchell, we just spoke to before, Claire, who's been suffering from long COVID syndrome for 12 months. Claire Hastie runs the long COVID support group. Dr. David Arnold, who's joined us as well, just to give us the latest on where medical opinion is and for us to run a few questions by him. We also spoke to Monique Jackson as well, who's been suffering long COVID since March. Corona Diary is her Instagram if you want to follow her. And also Norman Lamb as well, former Health Minister and Chair of the South London and Maudsley NHS Foundation Trust. Thank you for joining us on Times Radio, and thanks for getting involved, guys. We really appreciate all your messages. Sorry if we couldn't answer all of them. Let's take a quick pause. When we come back, Facebook, it has permanently suspended Twitter, Facebook, all of them. Twitter has permanently suspended Donald Trump. We'll find out what that means next from US tech expert. She's a legend in my eyes as well. Cara Swisher coming up.
The TLS podcast.